All right, welcome back to the Info Diet Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Guimarin. Today I'm joined by none other than John Robb, author of Brave New War and Global Guerillas. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Michael.
So John, for me, I've been following him. I've been following you for about 14 years now. I read the book, I want to say in like 2008. It came out in 2007, right?
Yep.
Okay, so I read it in 2008 at the urging of one of the aides, actually, from General Mike Mullen, or Admiral Mike Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time. And I've been really interested in fourth generation warfare and all the things that you've been talking about for, I guess, over a decade and a half now. But one of the questions that I wanted to start today's conversation was around sort of institutional rot. So I'm a millennial, and we are witnessing all of these institutions that are supposed to collect information and give guidance, and they should be very not political, right? Like when you think about like the FDA or the CDC, like what they're supposed to do, like for me, the idea that the CDC would be political is just so weird, because I have this image of the CDC as being those guys that helped us in the movie Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman from like the late 90s, right? Where it's like, they're just there to fight viruses, you know? And my father-in-law, who's in your generation, he's like, yeah, I never in my entire life would have thought that I'd have to question everything that the CDC is telling me, right? Because I would think it's just about health, like, hey, we have an outbreak of mumps or whatever. So I guess my question for you is, as a sense maker, do you think that these institutions, number one, are they corrupt, right? Or is it just we're witnessing more sort of this and that going on, if you will, because the internet allows for all of these previously suppressed positions to be published? Has it always been super political at the top with these institutions? And because, people's confidence in them is at record lows, I think.
Right. I think there was, a different kind of approach in the previous environment, because it was very structured. The Cold War provided a structure and a direction that, virtually everybody who's in charge today in these major institutions, had some exposure to. In fact, there's almost kind of a generalized kind of feeling of loss that we don't have that Cold War structure anymore. In fact, you could see that kind of tendency to recreate the Cold War by, with Russia and China, and then maybe, with the domestic counterinsurgency, to try to create that common enemy that would allow these experts in these institutions and these, government agencies to kind of command the level of compliance and get the level of support that they had in the past. Makes things much easier. It's much easier to be on the top of the heap, and the world makes sense. I mean, you go through the bureaucracy and you rise up through the ranks, and it makes sense in that regard. This world doesn't make as much sense. In terms of what we're seeing, in terms of what's going on with these agencies or with the institutions, is that they were built for that earlier environment, and for the most part, they were dealing with less complex problems, and much of their training and much of their focus is on how do you communicate with the population at the lowest level possible. So in terms of the CDC and health, public health in general, it's all about dumbing things down and telling them what to do, and anticipating that there will be little pushback, for these directives. And they're not meant to be nuanced. They're not meant to be intelligent directives. They're not meant to be debate points. They're meant to be followed and complied with. That doesn't work as well in dealing with complex challenges, and it doesn't deal well with complex people. And we're much more informed now. Anybody can dig up information on the internet now and become a kind of a micro expert, instant expert on stuff. And the existing experts hate that. I mean, they hate that. but you can spool yourself up. A relatively intelligent person can spool themselves up pretty quickly, and start asking questions that make things uncomfortable for experts. You see it in doctors' offices all the time. They hate that.
Right. Like I come in and I Googled my whole thing. Oh, well, Google says this. And then like, oh my God, now you're going to quote WebMD at me.
No, yeah. Well, you know what? I found more often than not that actually, if you do it in an intelligent way, it's actually helps you improve the quality of your healthcare. I mean, the doctors aren't spending, incredible amounts of time with every patient, and they're not necessarily, spooling up on all these different issues. And sometimes you bring things up and they go, oh, whoa, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we, I've done that innumerable times with different doctors and other people who are like, I'm interacting with, and then you bring something up and they go, oh, wow, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let me follow through with this, that kind of thing. It's the reason why they eliminated data, the genetic data from 23andMe. So people are coming back with, genetic information and their tendencies, and the doctors are going, based on studies, they were going, we don't even have access to this information. How do we even know how to respond to you? So sometimes you're way ahead in some instances than the doctors and the experts in general. So they're wrong approach, one kind of problem for the types of people you're going to interact with. That's the big problem with institutions.
Okay, so to summarize in my own understanding, you're saying that the institutions that we rely on were all built, let's say, like during the New Deal, for the most part, and after, and that the model of communication was more like broadcast television, right, where you had basically one person who was trying to communicate to a bunch of people that were basically in the dark, right? If they didn't have the TV on, they didn't get any news. And now, because literally everyone can be their own broadcaster, instead of a one-to-many relationship, it's a many-to-many relationship. And then add in the fact that it's so cheap to distribute information and, like you said, spin up and be a micro expert, that now the interrelatedness of concepts, the complexity is such that that sort of broadcast communication model doesn't work, but the incentives, the bureaucratic incentives for getting promoted and everything along the organization is all in that broadcast model. And of course, like, it helps to have a common enemy, right? So that's why we have like the war on drugs and the war on terror, right? So basically it's an evergreen common enemy. And that common enemy from the Cold War, when it was the USSR, allowed all these people to sort of row in the same direction. But now without that, they're sort of lost at sea.
Right. We don't have that internal cohesion anymore. We have more questions that we'd like to ask the experts, and they keep the message into these 30-second soundbite kind of frames. One of the things when we say that they're acting political, typically what it means is that they are responding to the pushback or the additional questions over the alternative theories and that you get from interacting with a networked population with irritation and anger and coercion, saying you're not allowed to think like that. I mean, just follow what we're saying, and that they're using the network to enforce that. And they think that they can, achieve that previous level of compliance and passivity with network controls. So, and as network controls come off as, coercion, authoritarianism, and the parties that support that, or the politicians that support that, tend to be the ones that people push back on for it.
Yeah. So, how do you see? So it's like the information environment has moved on from broadcast, right? Now it's complex. Now it's a network based, as you said, but the institutions have not.
Correct.
So if I'm a millennial, if I'm 35 years old, am I just going to have to wait it out? Like, do I need to wait 40 years for this to resolve itself? Or like a lot of people are asking, you have like Balaji and a lot of the sort of thinkers in Silicon Valley are looking at the relationship between governments and the population. And there's some people who are saying, okay, we need to reform these institutions. and then other people are saying we need to rebuild these institutions, right? So it's reform or exit. Do you think that, I personally think we're going to try reformation, it's not going to work, and then we're going to have to like rebuild them. But I'm curious from your perspective what you think, because you've probably seen a number of these cycles already where the institution has to get reformed because something fundamental changes.
Well, I think this change that we're seeing, not just through network information access, but also a network social interconnection, is fundamental enough, and that it's actually changing the way we think in our neural networks, that we're going to see the kind of change we saw with the printing press. And what I've been pointing towards is a kind of a wholesale change like we saw then. So we still had governance, but governance changed. So instead of a monolithic church, we had many different churches. And then instead of a feudal system, we saw constitutional governance, right? The written. And that we saw markets develop from, trading systems, where all the wealth is really in just the hands of a few, to these, complex fiat-based systems, whether or not it's a fiat or not, but it's like complex ledgers and small businesses and finances and all sorts of things that were made possible after printing, and then science. So we will see the big institutions change, and they have to change in order to fit this environment. But some of them won't make it, and some of them will be surpassed. I mean, we have this new decision-making system, this new combination of social net, interaction on the network, and as well as information aggregation on the network. And you throw in AIs, which are really just social AIs, because they live on that data in between us, the stuff we put onto the network, and that's going to build or be the foundation by which we build new systems of interaction. And so it's going to be, it could be traumatic war, or it could be collapse, or it could end up becoming something that we do on a more peaceful basis.
Certainly, I want to believe that if you told someone in the 15th century that basic civil administration would go away from the church, and now there'd be this extra judicial system, right? Like the government, like the way that I sort of frame and understand what you're saying is, it used to be if you wanted to get married or somebody died and you had to move property, you went to your church and you explained, hey, I want to get married. And then the church was the sort of keeper of record for these things. And then what you're saying is basically like when the printing press happened, the table got flipped. And so then the keeper of record is basically like the civil government, right? Like if I want to get married, now I go to the civil government. If I have property, there's like a titling system. And so I mean, even property for the most part was just, you had to be titled, right? You had to be in the feudal system in order to own property. So, moving beyond that, adding a professional bureaucracy initially to the feudal monarchs and then replacing them. That's a whole process, and it's traumatic. But the bureaucracies are amazing. I mean, bureaucracies are, the kind of the cockroach of organization of modernity. I mean, they made everything that we're seeing now possible because they could, marshal resources and allocate benefits, whether it's on the corporate level or at the government level. We react negatively to bureaucracy, but it is the foundational organizational structure for almost all organizations
today. They get things done. They can get you to the moon, or they can build your small business. I mean, you got a boss, you got employees, and you got middle tier managers or night managers and stuff like that. That's bureaucracy. That's hierarchy. Go ahead.
So I was going to say, like, somebody in the 15th century would probably think the idea of bureaucracy was weird, right? Like if you came back and you said, okay, well, everyone's going to work for different companies, they would be like, it would kind of blow their mind. And I'm just trying to think, like, you're saying that the internet is just as disruptive as that printing press was. And I tend to agree with you 100%. So if we even make it to the other side, because I kind of feel like it's going to take generations, and maybe it's my great-great-grandchildren, would we similarly think that it's also weird, right? Like the Catholic Church still exists, but it's not relevant. Is it going to be like the CDC still exists, but they're not relevant?
the change is going to happen over the course of our lifetimes and beyond. So, we're not going to see a lot of it. We'll just see the initial disruptive phases. I mean, when the church broke up and there were, or was challenged, and there were, people were, reading the word, and the people were learning to read because they were obligated to read the Bible. And then you had that fragmented things, and you had pamphlets, and that kind of written word was kind of disruptive because people had it and they're reading it. And now we're seeing variants of that. We're seeing like network patterns. And what I mean by patterns is ways you make sense of the rapid flow, of information on, that you get through your smartphone every day. These patterns tend to be co-curated and run by millions of people. And these patterns are extremely disruptive. They contain a lot of conspiracy elements, meaning they connect pieces of information that should not be connected. And then when events happen, it's like just taking a just recent examples. Okay, so Trump, Mar-a-Lago, secret documents, probably a big discussion or big fight over what goes to the archive and what doesn't, plus some handwritten notes, right? And so
that's what I think. I think it's totally a nothing burger.
Yeah, well, there might be some pieces of it there, but the thing is that immediately upon receiving that piece of information, and I think the raid was conducted as a result of trying to create that kind of furor, because it's adds to this perception going in that the midterms are about Trump. So it's a great political move.
Yeah,
and that the more they do that, the better they do. The Dems do in the midterms. But the initial news immediately caused people to start making, okay, he's traded it to Putin, he's traded to this. He was a conduit for all this secret information. And I mean, none of those connections were fully apologized for. No one backed off of them. And they were just like, would you know bureaucracy or how this thing works enough that kind of how it actually occurred. But it's that it contains those little conspiracy elements like that, or anything like when somebody says this is systemic X, it's happening everywhere. That's almost always an indicator that there's some kind of conspiracy kind of thinking involved. And that these patterns become oppressive, particularly if, the way a lot of them are geared towards describing people you hate or things you hate. Anti-fascists, for instance. Right? Most people have really no idea, what a fascist actually looks like. They just see the little jackboots and stuff like that. But Russians had jackboots, during communism, right? So it's like they militarized and did much of the same stuff. But they'll describe the behaviors they hate, and people will attack en masse. People and behaviors that they think are potentially indicators that it's fascist.
It's like you said earlier that our brains are being rewired. It's almost like this network consensus, if you will, this network action is rewiring us to destroy as a group, where it's just like, you just like, go destroy this thing, right? Trump racist, say it enough, people believe it. And you're like, okay, destroy. And then people go and do it. There's no...
Well, it's a decision-making system. Like markets, we're a decision-making system. Markets have a certain way of actually making decisions, and bureaucracy is a certain way of making decisions. And so when we had a government bureaucracy stand up, and that we wanted to replace the feudal monarchs in there, we used a market mechanism, voting, to replace the people that ran that bureaucracy or set the rules for that bureaucracy, which is like the legal structures. So you can mix and match them, but you have to figure out how to use them without destroying yourself.
Are you saying that anybody who's able to survive being canceled is going to be a leader in the future, right? It's like
no,
the market mechanism was voting, but now we're canceling. So if you can survive being canceled on a topic, now you get to be the leader.
No, I'm just saying is that network decision making, whatever that is, combination of the way the information is retrieved and at the individual level and processed, our network social arrangements are going to be formed into a decision-making system that will yield positive results at some point. It'll be glommed on to existing decision-making systems, social decision-making systems, and produce new ones, and that will benefit from that. And there's benefit if the pattern is correct, and people are signed on to it, to have millions of people co-curating and caring for it and moving it forward and helping to help people make sense of the external environment
so
through the use of that pattern. But the patterns right now are all.
Okay, so what were we talking about? Where did I cut out? I was getting it,
Yeah, I'm trying to think
where. Okay, we're talking about institutions, and then we're talking about.
We're talking about how this new social reality will get layered on top of sort of market decision making. I guess one thing I'd really like to get some clarity on is, so you've mentioned in your work a lot about consensus-based decision making, and when I think about using the market in a bureaucracy to make decisions, so consensus-based is sort of like, okay, there's a set of options, and so we're going to vote to pick one versus the other. And then as a group, we're going to decide, disagree, and commit to go with the one with the most votes. And then that's going to become our policy that we then broadcast out. And it seems likely to me, when I see decision-making on the internet, it's much more decentralized, and it looks as an emergent property, much more resonant. It's kind of like a school of fish where all the fish are swimming, and they have context both of globally what's happening, but also locally what's happening. So if there's a shark coming at a school of 1 million fish, not all million fish move, but just the ones near the shark. And that to me looks a lot less, like command and control that you would think of in sort of like one of these orange pyramidal institutional structures. And I'm just sort of curious, like, obviously the internet is allowing this to happen because it's reducing the cost of information distribution between all of those fish. Right. So now it's actually possible, but you sort of give up the, if everybody rows together, then we row faster thing. But what you gain in that is that you gain sort of like personal autonomy. Do you think, so like when you were saying it was kind of like an evolution, like, oh, we're going to layer on top this sort of social decision-making thing. Whereas to me, this idea of moving from like a battleship to a school of 1 million fish, even if it's the same mass, if you will, they seem like completely fundamentally different things.
I don't think so. I mean, so it goes back to even our politics, right? So when I initially looking at consensus, I was looking at more like, okay, it's like a coerced consensus, meaning that we all are thinking like this, so everyone else, even the periphery, should think like this too. So it's kind of like a mandated consensus,
right?
And that, it as I kept on looking at it, it looked more like you have these, patterns for way things should work and, should interact and be interrelated. And some are, extreme social patterns. And then others are kind of like, this is the way the government sees things, society, traditional society sees things, and this is how it should work. And that, this is our consensus. Getting to the specific point here is that there's two different ways that network decision making seems to work. One is that we all sign on to this pattern, so we all can move faster together because we all agree with it, right?
And there's a first mover advantage there, right? Because it's like whatever the first pattern is, it's like satisficing. Because I see this all the time. Like there's this huge herd momentum that goes.
Right. Oh yeah. So we have to figure out how to put together good enough patterns that can actually then, slowly morph and iterate towards something that's extremely useful, but allows us to wade through a ton of information very, very quickly as a group, right? And then we don't end up with everyone just going every which way and chaos, results, and we all end up dying in the interim. Plus, though, you also have this, everyone's doing their own research, everyone's like figuring things out on their own, and then moving the ball forward and as individuals in small groups, and that has a place too. So in politics, we see this, like, here's this mandated consensus pattern, and here's all these people who want to disrupt it because they see portions of it as detrimental. And trying to come up with that balance between the two. I mean, like in business, you don't want the people running a startup good at 15, 20 people or 30 people running a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure company. Fundamentally different groups. The startup folks would blow that thing up. It would fall apart almost immediately. The services, everything would, it would be an absolute mess. And the same is true in the opposite way. You don't want those kind of dry institutional big company folks from the infrastructure space running a startup. They just would fall apart in a second because there's not enough structure for them. Everything is too ill-defined. The path isn't laid out. So same thing with this is that we have to figure out how to do both. If we can't do both, then, and if everything is always up to, everybody just figuring out exactly what they want to do, then you just have kind of complete anarchy. And, trying to come up with that balance. I mean, in the written kind of, printing kind of world of modernity that we see, we had, for the kinds of activities that we were doing back then, we had, legal structures that kind of gave us the bounds of our behavior and rights, and that we were left up to do what we wanted to do. And the same thing in, the commercial market space. It allowed, most of the innovation comes out of these smaller groups. Most of the incremental improvements come out of the big consensus space. And then in our kind of situation with complex problems coming and hitting us on an ongoing basis is that we have to be able to work together as a group to solve a lot of these things.
Yeah, it's like, how do you be agile, but at the same time, align millions of people?
Right. I mean, way back when I was really starting to seed this, I was thinking, okay, well, I can see just even a basic value for this, a shared pattern, maybe a globally shared pattern. This is like just basic kind of human interaction. I mean, minimum stack, here's things you can do, or here's things you can't do. And very few, prohibitions, but they're shared with everybody. And that will, we can enforce it through the network to make sure that those things aren't, those.
So this would be like the network. The network is enforcing, like, we're against homicide, basically.
Well,
right? That would be like one of those things that we're against.
Yeah, but okay. So in the previous world, you didn't have the kind of network surveillance and interaction and, group pressure, social group pressure that could be applied at this level. We're going to be, as we start to go deeper and deeper in, within 10 years, everyone's going to have a camera, a video camera running all the time on their glasses. It's like all of that surveillance is going to be there. It's all going to be that, available. Plus all the, other people that are, riding along with that and interacting with people and being able to, enforce tons of stuff is going to be very, very easy to do. And so you have to figure out what the minimum is, and at least online, and typically some of it that is enforced by laws, but not all of it necessarily. And then
well, laws
leaving
almost institutionalized. So maybe like you're right. Like we have, I don't know, John, I can't see it, right? So when I went to school, I got my master's degree at Berkeley, and they recorded all of our class sessions for people who were absent. But then there were some students like me who had our name tags, because that was that kind of master's program. And so when we spoke, we had to like push a button. So there was a speaker, and then the webcam would know which button got pushed. So it would like zoom to you, right? And I remember asking, where did these recordings go? And they're like, oh, they go here. And then I was like, and you delete them, right? No, we gave them to the computer science department, and you sort of walk over there and you're like, what are you guys doing with these recordings? You're like, oh, this is really great. Like, what's your name? And then like they type it in, and it's got every single conversation that I participated in class for all 2 years of my master's program. And
that's cool.
I thought it's cool on one side, but on the other side, I thought about my daughter, who's now 6, who at the time was like 1 or 2. And I was like, she's literally going to get it like a DVD. I'm sorry. She's going to get a file when she's 18 years old. And it's going to be like every single thing that she ever did in school, just right there, right? Like, here's when you learned how to add, here, just everything. Here's where you hit that boy on the recess, just completely
well,
there.
That's the leading edge, because the AR glasses can be as common as smartphones in 15 years. 6 billion people will have them. And just like we have with smartphones everywhere. And those things are recording all the time, man. It's going to be constant.
Right. And so there was like a Black Mirror episode where they could like replay their entire life, and I had to stop watching Black Mirror after that episode. Like I couldn't physically watch another episode because that was so terrifying to me. And so you think the generation of my daughter, I don't think she's Gen Z. You think the generation after Gen Z, because they're going to be native to all this, is not going to have a problem with it. But like for me, it's like beyond uncanny valley creepy.
Well, you have to figure out ways to adapt to it. So at the social level, the social decision making level, it's like, what do you forget? What do you keep? What can you use to within the context of group decision making? What can be enforced? What can't be? What are the minimum behaviors that, if you see it, see somebody else engaging in it, what can you enforce and what can't you? But, we're trying, what we have a problem with typically are the groups that want maximal stacks. I mean, they have like all of these interactions, that they want to monitor, and here's all the infractions, and they total up to the moon, right? And
right.
they're not symmetrical either. They're like apply to certain people and not to other people, and they're very situational. They're very mercurial. They're constantly being modified and expanded, and those maximal stacks are causing us all sorts of heartburn.
Yeah, it's like
instinctually. Yeah, we're kind of feeling instinctually at a deep level that, hey, those things matter because they're going to start to be folded in to these technologies. They're going to be becoming part of the code. They're going to become part of the AIs. They're going to become part of our social behavior at this network level. And if they get too instantiated in that, these maximal stacks, these are the kind of things that could end up becoming horrendous.
Right. Like sort of the example from today, bringing in current events, is there was some random guy who was videotaping himself at the Delta counter, and they wouldn't, even though he had bought a ticket on the airline, he had been on the Delta do not fly list between, I guess, when he bought it and when he went to get his boarding pass, and it didn't work. And so like, there's an example of like a maximal stack, like they have some kind of surveillance. Somehow he made it on their list. Who knows if it's an error, right? And it's like, it's like that. What you're describing is like the opposite of Instagram, right? So everybody puts a version, their best possible version on Instagram. And what you're saying is that there's these groups of people that want to get the worst possible version of their enemies and then use that as a thing to be like, oh, look, these people are so bad. But like, I look at the surveillance and I say like I'm a human being. I make mistakes, John. I mean, they always joke, my generation jokes, oh, we wish we grew up in the 80s because then we would have Polaroids of all the bad things that we did instead of all these photo cameras. But I think about like video cameras for my kids or my grandkids just capturing, because there's no person that's like, good. Like you look at anybody, you can find a crime. You know what I'm saying? It's like you're going to find something wrong with every person.
Yeah, but I mean, also, it's going to be so much data. I mean,
but the AIs,
it's just like AIs. Yeah, I mean, the AIs have to have the training and to actually pick that up. They have to.
But like, let me give an example, right? So I used to be on I was involved with some very large infrastructure projects, and when Bill Binney, who was an NSA whistleblower, sort of like the generation before Snowden, he came out and he talked about ThinThread and Trailblazer. You can go look about them on Wikipedia. And the idea is like, oh, we're collecting all this data, so I'm just going to create junk data, and then the system is not going to be able to match me. And that's what I thought for a really long time. And then I realized at the point of ingest, these profiles are being made. So this idea that it's so much data that we can't solve it, I fundamentally do not believe that. Having seen a system that operates over billions of people, like I know for a fact that that's not a thing. It's not like too much data. It's like on ingest, it gets decided, oh, which profile is this part of, and then just attached like a NoSQL sort of object.
Right. I think the idea of just producing a ton of stuff worked for the early internet, where you're trying to hide from somebody searching something about you. And if you're not producing data that goes up online, then whoever does produce something about you and puts it up online controls your profile.
Well, that's the thing. I was nutty conspiracy theorists are like, oh, well, I don't use Facebook. I'm like, the Facebook like button is on every single page on the internet. They have a profile for you regardless of that. And they're one of a dozen organizations that do that. So like not using the internet was like just as much a tell that you were a person of interest as using it.
Oh, sure. I think, yeah.
Not being on the list.
Getting offline. Exactly. Right. You're on the list if you go offline, or you're trying to like become a black hole. There's kind of a long view kind of a, way of thinking about this is that we're just at the point where kind of the technology and history is kind of opening its eyes and can record your presence, your contribution. I mean, up to now, it's always been kind of a silent thing. It's forgotten by the people. Everything that your descendants forget is lost, unless you've written something, and oftentimes what you've written doesn't necessarily even get saved. Now we're getting into this like digital age where more and more of that info is being captured, and if you're producing a ton that goes on, and goes online, gets saved, gets archived, gets pooled, that you are making a contribution to whatever training of AIs and other things in the future, and you're having an influence on them by making a contribution.
Is this also kind of like the phenomena where music today is not better than the music 50 years ago in a lot of cases, and so people are listening to that old music, and so with every incremental song that you make, the bar to making a hit is that much higher because people have access to the whole catalog, which is sort of like, in my view, is a microcosm of what you're saying, right? Because you're saying like, push this out 10 generations. Now we have 10 generations worth of lifetime training data, right? But now you're also being compared against those 10 generations where like nobody even knows who their, 3 generations up person was or what they did. So there's zero comparison.
Yeah. Another long view kind of thing that may answer a little of this is that if you think of the way AIs and the internet interacts, is that in way we kind of save information or save knowledge and save insight, and kind of in a way that allows it to transcend generations, is that we're in the process of trying to train up all these AIs, these social AIs, with bits and pieces of information, whether it's like a work-related thing or a, hands-on functional thing, how to, carve this specific thing on a chair that you're making, and capturing all of that information so in ways that actually can constitute a skill, constitute a repeatable thing, that the kind of information and knowledge that's normally lost between generations
so
has to be retrained. This is like the big project to humanity, is like everything that we've learned and finding a way to put it into the system.
Yeah, it's like you have a golem in your family, and over the generations it learns the wisdom of every single person, and so now you can go and talk to them and be like, hey, what should I do here? And they're like, well, your great grandfather did this and this is how it worked, and they're like, it's like able to tell you based on your family history. That's like what you're saying, right?
But do it on a societal level. If you ever wanted to learn how to do a specific crafting activity or specific job or specific calculation or whatever, being able to tap into what the best people or a variety of different people have put into the system in order to solve that or do that or train, learn how to actually do this specific mechanical task is incredibly useful. I mean, I find it useful. I would benefit from it. And we're right at that point where we're going to start to do that in mass, and seems less apparent right now, but right now, most of the stuff we're doing is just building the core building blocks, like training linguistic AIs. And, if you're driving a Tesla, you're training the Tesla to drive, right? The Tesla system.
It seems like we're on the one side, we're like about to go through the looking glass if we're not already. Because it seems, to your point, right? It's like we're training up this AI to do something very simple like GPT-3, which is just like copy all of human language. But now you're saying every single person, because they're always wearing AR glasses, whoever made a piece of pottery, the system is able to generalize that at some, and then the AI. And so now you want to make a piece of pottery. And so you can benefit from every single person in the previous generations that was fully recorded knowledge. So your speed of real acquisition is like in the Matrix, basically.
And if it learns that this technique works and this one doesn't, this one achieves this effect and this one doesn't, and then you can actually, all the different tools that you could make off of that would be amazing. My problem is that I don't see us necessarily moving more towards the tools and empowerment and leverage side of this. We're tending to focus more on the just kind of,
but isn't that
side and distraction side?
Yeah, but isn't that the whole like sequence of technology? Is it always starts off as a weapon before it's used for good? Like, are there any tools that we create that we don't use first to destroy?
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I guess maybe we saw a little bit of that in certain technology areas, but I mean, we have problems and we solve those problems, and we, with technology, and some of it is used for warfare, and if depending on how prominent warfare is in the society at the time, but then more of it will be applied to that. I mean, you get
like
big
the
leaps,
internet, right? Like we didn't do internet because we were, trying to solve a problem. The problem was we were worried about all of our knowledge getting nuked, right? That was the problem. It's like
survivability, yep. Right.
Or like nuclear energy came after nuclear weapons.
Well, there's nuclear war, and also solar flares, and also all sorts of range of different potential disaster scenarios led to the creation of the internet. And and nuclear power reluctantly almost came out of the nuclear program. I mean, because it went a different direction.
You could argue that fusion energy never happened because there's no weapons application for it, right? Like we spend billions of dollars on the National Ignition Facility, which is this laser fusion, which is all for studying how hydrogen bombs blow up, and almost nothing on like actual long-lived non-weapons related fusion research, right? And so that's why they always like, oh, it's 20 years out, because it's like they've never actually spent any money on it.
I think they spent a ton of money on it. It's just it's the technological foundation necessary to actually pull it off hasn't been achieved. It's complex. You have to manipulate magnetic fields and hold that plasma bubble in a specific place, and then capture energy off of it. It was like watching drones, right? And anything kind of self-driving or self-flying. It didn't happen until the control system necessary to pull that off was put into, was capable of being run on a standardized chip.
So you're basically like, if cell phones hadn't been invented, we wouldn't have drones, because the technology wasn't, the economies of scale to shrink it wasn't there.
Yeah, there's lots of precursors. You had to have you have to have good wireless tech, but I think the key one was the command and control, being able to if you look at the robotics at any of these firms that have been around for a while, you'll see the big ones with wires hanging out of them, and big control system that was being built to allow it to manipulate its legs and the like. And then within 5 years or 6 years after that, it's down to something that can run off of batteries. And same thing with space flight. I mean, Musk only really was able to get this thing down in cost once he started to do vertical landings. But a command and control system, it was a control system that made that possible. And again, the amount of compute cycles that you had to run in order to make that work wasn't possible on the previous hardware. So you had to wait till Moore's Law caught you and made it possible. I mean, some people have made the connection that, or that in 2010, the compute capacity of the standard chip was about equal to what you'd see on a flying insect. Okay, and once it crossed that barrier, all of a sudden we got drones. It's like,
so once we get enough compute to do an animal, we can recreate that animal. That's pretty awesome.
Well, I mean, their locomotion at least, and some of their sensory capability. But it was, it's like kind of a magical thing. All of a sudden you can do that. It was like most of the AI stuff we saw, that kind of basic methodology was around in what, 2007, 2006.
No, the AI stuff is all from the 70s. And it was because a bunch of Belgian guys put a bunch of graphics cards together because they didn't want to spend $2 million on a supercomputer, that they figured out how to use GPUs and CUDA cores to run all of these things. And that blew, it was 2011, right? It blew out the whole thing.
Right. But the most recent iteration of the algorithms were, released before we had the compute capacity to actually make it work.
Yeah.
And so as the compute capacity reached that level where it was possible to actually get some results in a meaningful time, and run the number of iterations necessary to actually train it successfully, all of a sudden this brute force method actually was yielding results. And up to that point, you could you'd run it once and it's not working. Run it twice. 5 days later, you see it again. No, it's not working again. You could run it 1,000 times. You can run it 1,000,000 times. Wait a second, it's actually yielding results. I can start tweaking things and start playing with it. The compute cycles, unlocked it as a methodology.
So to get back to the information environment, do you feel like because Moore's law has stopped or has shifted, right? So everybody is now investing in custom silicon. So basically ASICs as opposed to CPUs. So from the most general to the most specific seems to be the direction that we're going. Do you feel like that's going to give society a time to catch up with the information environment? So I'm looking at right now on my other screen, one of these, I type in a bunch of words and then it paints different pictures in the style of Monet or Rembrandt or whatever. And so to the point that you just made, it's that seems to have obviated the need. I can literally generate anything in the style of Monet, right? So, I mean, this is an example of machine learning that is just incredible. And it's going to change everything with copyright and all that. We're going to go through that whole cycle again, like we did with music.
Right.
Do you think
like
because
we did with music?
Right.
Yeah, we have precedent, right? Music gave us a kind of early example.
The thing that I always go back to with the music example, because people sort of lost it in 2016. For me, the last 6 years feels a lot like when in the late 90s, Kazaa and Napster came out and the RIAA, which I'd never heard of, started suing 80-year-old grandmothers because their kids downloaded 5 songs for $800,000, right? And that kind of insanity that came from that, because their entire business model shifted from basically CD distribution to curated lists, right? And it took another, 15 years before you got Spotify, which is sort of where music has ended up. I feel like that's happening across all of society. So maybe to your point, it's okay, you disturb the pond, but then eventually it sort of figures its way out.
Right.
Yeah. I'm just kind of curious if that's going to happen in our lifetimes with all these things. Cause you're right. Wearing AR glasses again, 100% of the time is going to just totally change everything.
Right. And you can already start to see the shift also with neural chips. I mean, with the multi-core neural chip in the new iPhones, 16 core. And I mean, just to enhance things and make things faster, make things more analog-like, right? But, faster graphics, faster AIs, faster processing for a fraction, a tiny, tiny fraction of the energy cost. That's the kind of thing that could actually turn, make whatever controller that's feeding and turning the pixels and turning, creating the environments on the AR glasses just zoom. Get really good, really quick.
I think you still believe all this is going to be a net benefit for society because it's just a tool, and we always tend to create things.
Look, well, that's. I think that's the case if we continue to go out and expand. And I think a lot of the kind of sense-making depression kind of talk from Schmachtenberger and even Jordan at times is because we're not going forward. And we're actually kind of collapsing in on ourselves, and we're trying to make sense and figure out a way to live just on Earth and solve all our problems and become more capable of interacting at a deeper level or whatever that is. I don't see that happening. I see that as more of a kind of recipe for collapse, and on a variety of different levels. I think we have to keep on going.
if we don't push the frontier, that we're going to collapse, because there's no you're basically like, what you're saying is, okay, we've reached the limits of our biosphere, and as a result, everything has become a zero-sum game, and it's a zero-sum game down to the bottom. And if we don't figure out a way to expand to Moon, the asteroid belt, Mars, then it's sort of existential for the whole species.
Yeah, I mean, just like, yeah, exactly. I mean, you can't clean up, like, for instance, you can't fix the environment when it's like being in a factory town, where all the jobs are in this factory, and the factory's killing the people who are working at the factory and all their families too. But you can't stop the factory if the decision's just being made there, right? Even if the factory owner's there and he wants to change things, he can't, because everyone's going to be unemployed. No one will have the money to even clean it up or fix it. So you have to widen the system in order to make that possible, where that there are the economy and the world won't stop if you try to fix things locally.
Right, and that's
something
what's
else
happening.
Outside. Right,
They're
we're trying to fix the plane while we're flying it.
Yeah, like they basically were like, okay, we have this 16-year-old girl who said that we should fix the factory, and so they turned off all the machines so they could fix it, and the whole thing is just blowing up. I mean, it's. I hope this recording gets saved for like 10 generations. People,
and,
let me tell you, watching Germany collapse just blows my mind.
Right. It's just that, I appreciate that there are a lot of people who think that a simpler life is better, and granted, it is in many ways, but kind of the pastoral life, and then there's even people who think, we should go back to being tribal, but you don't do it with 7 billion people, and you do it with a couple 100,000 globally. Yeah. I mean, you need that much space to even fit them in, right?
I think
so they're not going to be the people.
A hunter-gatherer society requires about 1,000 acres per person.
Correct.
So, and an industrial society, I think, is like 2 acres per person, right? And agricultural, I think, is somewhere like 10 or 20 acres. So this idea that we're going to go from, like you said, like from an industrial society where you need basically like 2 or 3 acres to 100, I mean, it's just totally absurd. I mean, basically everyone that has to die in order for that to happen, which is just just ridiculous.
And going back to even the agricultural level of kind of the 1600s, which everyone thinks is kind of the ultimate and sustainable at the highest level of technology that's possible. Maybe they think there's some way of maintaining all the existing technologies that have pared down that would work within that kind of 16th century agricultural environment. It's not going to work. It's not going to. You can't. Not only can you not get there, it'll fundamentally change everything that about your life. You spend all your time working for food, just to eat every day, like 95% of your time. Yeah, that's what they did. Everybody did.
Literally 120 years ago in the U.S., 90% of people had to work that day to eat that day.
Correct. Every day.
I don't.
No weekends off, except for maybe Sunday mornings. But outside of that, nothing.
Yeah, I don't really get it. But then again, I'm not, a billionaire who's 80 years old. So it's also a psychology thing, is that if you're going out and you're, if we can like go after low-hanging fruit and solve kind of solar collection, space-based solar power, and beam the stuff down, it's safe. It's like do it on volumes that you'd have to build 40 to 80,000 nuclear plants to even equal what you could produce from solar at even a modest installation, and which of course would be way too dangerous. Imagine those things going, even one accident, let alone some percentage of those. It changes our mindset. We start to think about tools and how to do things. I mean, like say, what would the Earth look like if most of the manufacturing, energy production, everything else was moved off? It's orbit or above, right? You can start focusing on making the environments and the places that we live better, and focus on improving that and the kind of tools that you would need to be able to do that. But if you start to like collapse in and start to do less, so you really think
solve problems is one.
You really think we're going to be able to put manufacturing in space and just pull everything down that we need?
Well, that's where all when we hit the limits of the raw materials that are available here, the raw materials are going to be available in the asteroid belt in volume, right? Some of those things that could supply us for thousands of years. Nickel and all the other precious metals that we're running out of here for most of the kind of core technologies we consider important are available in abundance in the asteroid belt. And why bring it all back down here in order to manufacture and producing the kind of entropy that produces? You do it there, and you finish the finished product comes back.
Yeah.
And then if you want to recycle it, you send it back up. You melt it down, up. It's like you externalize the entropy, keep the entropy out of where we live. It's like the basic rule of like camping. You don't defecate where you eat and where you sleep. You go off a ways away. It's like you gotta think of it in those terms. Like, why do that all here? And it kind of gets to this kind of expansionary mindset. It's like good for you. I mean, it changes your perspective if you're thinking about everything is terrible. We still have all these problems. And people are starting to distract themselves more and find go off on all these different tangents of mental masturbation of one type or another. It's like that's a kind of recipe for collapse, descent, destruction, and
you're just basically saying, look up.
Yeah, I mean, look up.
Heavens.
It's at least one forward vector. There's lots of others that will follow out of that, but it's like an inevitable thing. If you think, okay, how do we get to the only forward vector I've ever seen that like at a macro scale kind of describes where we should end up is kind of like, how do you get to a type 1 civilization?
Yeah.
Right? You have to collect enough energy or produce enough energy to equal what the sun delivers to the earth on any given day. Or at least be able to match that. And
then if you get to be
path, we can't do it.
Yeah, it's the Kardashev scale, by the way, everybody.
Right. Exactly.
If you get to be a type 1 civilization, then you at least have visualization into being a type 2 civilization, which is for the sun.
And assuming that always as you're progressing, you're going to require more energy. It's just an inevitable thing. It's like you want to
the factory town just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and that's how you clean up the factory town.
Yeah, and then the AIs that we develop will have to be trained, and then they're chewing up as much as a small city now, just for a couple of days of training, and then they go up. You start to run simulations, and you start to run massive simulations to try to figure out the kind of outcomes from different actions and different things that are occurring in a whether they're social or governmental or whatever.
Okay.
Those all require tons of energy. Send them up. Yeah. Put the cloud up there.
Final thought, John. Are we one of those simulations right now?
Yeah, that's a big one, right? Are we a simulation? No way of knowing, right?
Yeah.
Are you in my simulation, or is it at a personal level? Is it a lot of physicists and people who come from that side think of this as a kind of a whole system simulation? The universe is a simulation,
right?
But there's a more basic kind of thing that this could be just a personal simulation, whether it's like training you or trying to replicate you and running through a personal simulation, and the amount of data that's necessary to actually run that is relatively low, and you could run lots more of them. So maybe it's more likely that you or I we're being simulated on an individual basis.
God created the world in 7 days. What he really did was wrote a computer program where he could put souls into it that would then test them in some way. And so we're all participating in some grand connected simulation.
Right. So it's like, yeah, exactly. It's like Nietzsche was here. He'd say, okay, that eternal recurrence, this is kind of the same thing. It's like we're in this like iterative simulation of our lives until we get good at it, right? Or a variety of different experiences until we get really, really good. If you had to train this is like getting into the realm of obviously science fiction, but if you had to train an AI that had the human type characteristics, but who was given incredible amounts of power and capability on the backside, you'd have to actually run them through a ton of simulations in order to make sure that they wouldn't abuse it when they got it.
Yeah.
See what I mean? It's like,
yeah. So basically, you're like, it's like Buddhism, right? So like every single life, you have to learn a new lesson, and sort of the nirvana of it is now you get turned over an entire civilization's technology.
but you could run through billions of iterations in a second.
Right, and that's all of us.
Right, that's all of us. Or they, pick out people that they wanted to, who are
it's
unique problem
massively
solvers.
paralyzed, right? Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. All right, John, Robb, thank you so much. I want to have you back. This was amazing. I'm sorry that we had to cut it a little bit. I'm going to end
no
the
problem.
here.
I can't believe I broke that thing. I hope I didn't break this microphone. It's one of those Yetis. Like I used it, maybe 50 times, and now it's broken. That sucks. But anyway, it is what it is.